portraits of him over the next decade or so.
I love these portraits that Holbein does of Erasmus. They have a detachment in their scrutiny and in their intense observation, but they're also so intimate. And it's as if Holbein, and by extension us, the viewer, has somehow crept into Erasmus's study and is peeking over the shoulder of the great scholar as he's wrapped up in his fur-lined cloak to keep the draughts away. And we're watching as he writes his commentary to St. Mark's Gospel that we can read there, but we've caught him unawares. And in a way, there's a parallel between what the young artist is trying to do and what his intellectual mentor is doing. As Erasmus scrawls away, so Holbein has this intense control, and in a way, he's trying to produce some kind of parallel in a visual form to what Erasmus is doing in intellectual and written form. But the intellectual and religious turmoil in Middle Europe had certain negative spin-offs for artists, not least because religious commissions were suddenly frowned upon. And in addition, Holbein's portrait business here in Basel had all but dried up. So he looked further afield, starting in 1524 by a trip to France, where he tried to get work at the court of Francis I, but that was unsuccessful. And then, 2 years later, probably with a recommendation from Erasmus himself, he set sail for Tudor England to try and get work at the court of Henry VIII. And it was during the early part of Henry VIII's reign that the Renaissance was established in England. Architects, craftsmen, sculptors, painters and poets were all encouraged to make the journey across the Channel so that the king and his ministers might harness their talents to proclaim the power and sophistication of the Tudor monarchy.
It was Erasmus's links with England that provided Holbein with his first introduction to the English court. Chief amongst Erasmus's friends, and the first port of call for Holbein, was Thomas More, a fellow scholar and soon to become Lord Chancellor of England. More welcomed Holbein to his Chelsea home and commissioned him to paint a number of portraits of his household. Most of these no longer survive, but we have this delicate study for an elaborate family portrait. What does survive, however, is one of Holbein's most direct and precise portraits, that of Sir Thomas More himself, painted in 1527. More stares off into space, a man whose thoughts were on this world and the next, wearing the rich gold chain of a privy councillor. What really grabs the viewer's attention, though, and perhaps makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck, are the hairs on More's chin, and the extraordinary detail rendered through hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny brushstrokes, which creates an image that seems almost photographic. In spite of his success here in England, Holbein had to return to Basel in 1528 because he was in danger of losing his citizenship. And over the next few years, in both Switzerland and then again here in England, he was to witness the full onslaught of the Reformation and its political consequences. During Holbein's absence, the Reformation had begun to take serious root here in Basel, and the implications were political as well as religious, with a small Catholic oligarchy being threatened by a Protestant democracy. But things turned ugly at the beginning of 1529, on Shrove Tuesday, when the whole city was supposed to be celebrating. And suddenly, an angry mob came up the hill here to the cathedral, broke in, tore down statues, smashed stained glass windows, and triggered off a wave of iconoclasm throughout the city. It's difficult to know what Holbein's religious views were at the time. He was born and brought up a Catholic, and he'd painted many religious works for Catholic patrons and churches. It's almost certain that many of Holbein's works were destroyed in the rioting, as very few still survive. But what he did out of economic necessity and what he did from conviction, we'll never fully know. There's a clue, though, to his developing religious inclinations during the turbulent decade of the 20s in this woodcut, Christ as the True Light, which shows Christ pointing to a candle which illuminates the entire image and shows the way to the poor and the ordinary on the left, whilst to the right, the Pope and other church dignitaries follow Plato and Aristotle, the philosophers of the ancient classical pagan world, into the abyss, an image of clear and strong Protestant sentiment, challenging the authority of the Catholic Church and its arcane teachings. During his time back in Basel, Holbein found time to paint a portrait that wasn't a commission, and in fact, for many, was the most intimate work of his life. It shows his wife, Elspeth, and two of his four children, Philip, who's about 6, and Katharina, who's 2. In fact, Elspeth is pregnant with the third child when this was made.
And it's a very curious work, not least because the background seems so bleak. It's black, it enhances the figures, it makes them stand out in relief, and it also emphasises the fact that the composition mirrors the traditional image of the mother and child, or in fact Leonardo's image of St. Anne, the Madonna and Child. But in fact there's something more practical here, or impractical, because somewhere down the line after Holbein finished this work, and he did the portraits on paper, they've been cut out and then mounted on a panel, and so this isn't quite how they're intended to be seen. But it's a very, very sad work. His son looks up, I think, more in hope than in expectation. And the daughter, the young Caterina, doesn't seem to know the figure that's painting her. But look at the face of the wife. She's red-eyed. Her face looks slightly puffy. And it's almost as if she knows that Holbein is not going to be around for much longer. And in fact, he isn't. He can't find work in Basel. And so in the end, in 1532, he goes back to England and never returns, leaving the family, effectively, to fend for themselves.
But the England of 1532 was dramatically different from the country that Holbein had left in 1528. In fact, it was on the edge of revolution, with Henry VIII in the middle of trying to secure a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. The divorce scandalised Europe and led to a split with the papacy, with Henry VIII proclaiming himself head of the Church in England. Holbein's patron, Sir Thomas More, opposed the divorce, resigned, and was eventually executed, but it doesn't seem to have had a detrimental effect on the painter's prospects, because very soon he was moving in the circles surrounding the future Queen, Anne Boleyn, including More's rival and later Chancellor of the Exchequer, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell became the architect of the English Reformation, supporting the break with Rome and cementing it through the dissolution of the monasteries. He was depicted in both oil paint and even more tellingly in this preparatory drawing by Holbein as a man of ruthless, single-minded ambition.
And in the midst of all these troubles, and directly connected to them, Holbein is commissioned to paint what becomes his most celebrated, famous and complex work. This one, The Ambassadors, painted in 1533, showing two men, a rare example, a very early example in European art, of a double full-length portrait. Jean de Dinteville, he's the ambassador from the French court in London, and Georges de Sèvres, he's the Bishop of Lavaur, who comes over because his friend Jean is having problems negotiating with Henry VIII on behalf of the King of France, because Henry is antagonistically involved in an argument with the Pope. Now, Jean de Dinteville commissions the portrait, and that might explain why he seems to be the most prominent figure. He dominates, certainly in terms of surface area. As always with Holbein, the details give us a much greater sense of knowledge of these two men and their world. For a start, Jean clutches an elaborate dagger sheath that has on it his age, 29. Georges leans on a book that gives us his age, 25. And then we realise that in the centre of the picture, between the two men, is a celebration of the Renaissance world and scholarship that the two of them practice. So, starting at the top, Holbein gives us a celestial globe of the stars and the heavens, and also recently invented navigational tools. And then down below, there's a terrestrial globe.